Hey guys, welcome to my first drive video on this brand new A5 Avant TDI Mild Hybrid Plus. At the back end of last year, I actually flew down to Nice for the launch of the new A5 and S5. But during my time down there, I focused on the S5. And if you haven't seen that video already, I'll put a link to it at the top of the screen here. I have to commend Audi UK for giving us a diesel option on one of their brand new models. I know you can still buy a diesel C-Class, but you can't, and it breaks my heart to say it, buy a diesel 3 Series BMW, at least here in the UK. Before we go any further, I want to try and explain Audi's new badging strategy. Last year, in 2024, Audi decided that they wanted to reserve all of their even model designations, like the A4 and the A6, for their electric vehicles only. With that new strategy in place, it meant that the A4 Saloon, or the A4 Avant as we knew it at least, with a combustion engine, was no longer. So they replaced it with the A5 Saloon and this A5 Avant. Now, if you're still with me and you haven't fallen asleep, it gets even more complicated. Fast forward a few months to January 2025, and Audi have decided that they're going to go back on their new naming strategy, and they're not going to reserve even numbers for electric vehicles only. The new A6 with a combustion engine that's being launched at the beginning of March is going to be called an A6. It was going to be called an A7 until literally a few weeks ago. They changed that, decided it was a bad idea. We're going to call it an A6. We're going to stick to our guns. Great. But the new A5 2-litre TDI starts at £45,900. For that, you'll be getting a saloon front-wheel drive in the basic sport trim. You can add £2,000 for a bigger boot, i.e. the Avant version, or if you want to get a launch edition, like this press car, you can spend an eye-watering £58,900. And that's before you option in a £2,200 panoramic roof. Yeah, that's right. You could spend over £60,000 on your 2-litre diesel A4. Sorry, I mean A5. In terms of styling, it just doesn't do it for me. I remember thinking that at the launch, even with the S5. Sure, it's not ugly, but I don't think it's anywhere near as pretty as the A4 that it replaces. I did think, living with this car for the past week, its looks might grow on me, but they really haven't. But talking about growing, well, this has grown compared to the outgoing A4. Its wheelbase is 8 centimetres longer, and in fact its overall length, well, it now sits 10 centimetres longer than a 3 Series Touring. It's also a little bit wider, not that you would know it, because to me it looks very long but very thin, which I think is part of the reason it doesn't help itself in terms of looks, because we all love muscular looking cars. In fact, I recently had a couple of Audi's wonderful RS6s, and what makes those cars look so good is their flared wheel arches and their stance on the road. This one doesn't have that, in my opinion. Under the bonnet, we have the wonderful tried and tested Volkswagen Group 2-litre TDI engine. At the back of the engine, we have a power generator, which essentially helps this car with propulsion. It can give, via electrical energy only, up to 230 Newton meters of torque. And that's mostly useful for slow speed maneuvers or pulling away from lights, etc. And we will experiment with that once we get it out on the road. That power generator or electrical motor is connected to a water-cooled 1.7 kilowatt hour battery that's located underneath the boot floor. As you can imagine, there's loads of regen going on in this car when you're wasting energy, i.e. pulling up to a set of traffic lights. It's all very clever and far more sophisticated than any other mild hybrid system that I've experienced, but it does add a fair amount of weight, and I'm sure it helps add a fair amount of cost to the 60-odd thousand pound retail of this particular car. Combined, they give a maximum output of 204 horsepower and 400 Newton meters of torque. That runs through Audi's 7-speed S-tronic gearbox and is fed to the ground, at least in this car, via the front axle alone. Audi claim this will do the 0 to 62 sprint in 7.7 seconds and go on to a top speed of 149 miles an hour. Seeing as this is a diesel mild hybrid, we should talk about efficiency. Audi claim that this will do a combined 53.3 miles to the gallon for the launch edition or the edition 1, which is another version. But if you go for the entry-level Sport or S-line trim, which I assume have smaller contact patches, well, they'll do a claimed 56 miles to the gallon, which is a little bit better, but still not really any better than the A4 Avant 2-litre TDI that it replaces. This is going to be a bit of an old school Joe Achilles video. Originally, I'd planned to do a bit of a hypermiling video in this car, but because my health hasn't been brilliant lately, spending hours and hours behind the wheel of a car is probably not the best thing I can do. So I've decided to do a bit of a mileage-based video, driving part of the video at least, and hopefully at the end of it we can summarise by giving you a realistic combined MPG figure. We're going to be on some A roads and B roads, we're going to be on some motorways, and we're even going to head into Bicester. So a bit of everything, and we'll keep an eye on the combined average. I reset the trip computer seconds before I switched the cameras on, and hopefully this Osmo is picking that up nicely. Now, the first thing to do when you get in this car, and so many modern cars today, is switch off all of the safety aids that want to kill you. Things like lane departure, also any of the speed bongs and warnings, because they drive you absolutely mad. At least they drive me absolutely mad. And that's not because I speed, it's because a lot of the time the cars read the signs wrong. For instance, this was telling me I was in an 80 zone going through a village a minute ago, which was a 30 zone. Doesn't make any sense. So the car gets it wrong and therefore starts binging and bonging of you. So you just press this warnings button down here and you can switch them off using these shortcuts here. There are so many warnings and things in this car, you wouldn't believe it. That's actually Silverstone over there, which isn't too far from where I live, and this is kind of our starting location, if you like. We're going to do a nice big loop, should be about 50 odd miles, and I'm really looking forward to it. The sun's decided to come out, although, well, it's 4 degrees now. It was about 2 or 3 degrees when I was doing my intro, and it felt even colder than that. So yeah, it's nice to be in the car in a heated seat, and this has also got a heated steering wheel, which does make all the difference. Anyone that's used a heated wheel will know exactly what I'm talking about. It sounds a little bit gimmicky, but once you've experienced one, especially during a cold winter, there really is nothing better. Right, as we join the A43 dual carriageway, we're going to get up to speed. I'm going to drive this normally, not over the top, not spiritedly, but also not economically. I've already told you I've got my heated seat on low now and the steering heating on. I've got air conditioning on. I'm using this car as I would normally use a car. Again, speed limit is wrong. It's telling me it's 60 here. It's not, it's 70. So yeah, if I had all of the speed warnings switched on at the moment, the car would be telling me that I'm going the wrong speed, when I know in fact that I'm not. I'm even going to set the cruise control there at 70. There we go, lovely. It has all of these sort of self-drive features which still freak me out a little bit in modern cars, but they all seem to work pretty well. On that note, let's talk a little bit about the interior. Let's start with the driving position and the seats themselves. The driving position in this latest platform is better than the previous generation. Just a little bit. I feel like I'm sitting a bit lower, definitely got a lot more headroom, and the seats are also really nice. They're quite plain and simple, but they're very comfortable, they're supportive enough, and they seem to adjust really well. So in terms of driving position and front seats, really good. Then when we get in the back, well, I'd seen a few people review these online, maybe saying that the rear of the cabin's not that spacious. And I must admit, when I went to the launch event, I didn't have time to jump in the back of that S5 Avant. But I have in this one briefly, and with my driving position, this seat where it is, I'm 6'4", I can comfortably sit behind me. My knees are very close to this seat, but there's plenty of headroom, plenty of shoulder room, and it's actually quite spacious back there. You'd hope that it would be, because as we talked about on the outside, this car is longer. And remember, 8 centimeters longer wheelbase, which in turn you would hope would open up the actual cabin space. And although it doesn't feel like you've got 8 centimeters more legroom back there, it definitely feels decent, reasonable, big enough. But when we get to the boot, well, the boot is where it struggles a little bit. You see, the majority of cars in this segment, even my M3 Touring, for instance, or the outgoing A4 Avant, they have about 500 litres of boot space when you're using all of the seats. But this one, well, it has 448 litres, so you lose 50 plus litres, and that's all down to the fact that this is a mild hybrid plus system car. It has that battery in the boot, and I'm sure some other bits of tech that are hiding underneath the boot floor, and therefore you lose some boot space. So that's not ideal. It still feels like it's a big boot, and Peggy's been in there, and in fact we've used this car to do a couple of runs to the tip. Then we move on to the rest of the cabin. Now, build quality. In some ways it's better, in other ways I'm not convinced. There's a lot of cheaper plastics and materials below the waistline. As soon as you get down the lower bits of the doors and down here, round here, there's some scratchy, cheaper plastics, but you'll find those sort of plastics in my M5 Touring that's coming soon, and that car's 120 grand. Unfortunately, the reality is these days you'll find cheaper plastics hidden away in pretty much all cars below 150,000 pounds. But above the waistline, and I did talk about this in my S5 review, that I really think, at least to look at all of this sort of dashboard layout, these screens, the cabin in general, it's a really nice place to sit, it's a nice place to be, and it feels way more modern in here than the car and the model that it replaces. And you would hope that, especially for the 60-odd thousand pounds they're asking for this particular car, which is just mind-blowing. All of this infotainment works extremely well. It's very, very fast. It links up to your phone very well. I'll use Android Auto on here normally, always, but I'm not for this video, so you can get an idea of where we're going on the map, etc. But that all links up very well. We've got a Bang & Olufsen sound system in this particular car, and that sounds fantastic. The way the speakers mold into the door cards is just awesome. Everything works well. I'm not sure about all this piano black trim down here. I don't know why any manufacturers do this, because it's just a recipe for scratches, and this one's already got marks and scratches all over it. The actual digital dash, or virtual cockpit as Audi founded that name, although I've got everything in front of me that I kind of need, I do miss just some cool sort of back to basics dials on there. There's a couple of view options, but really I haven't found a way of bringing up a traditional looking set of dials, and you'd think that that would have been in the software, because it's not rocket science. So maybe I'm missing something there, or maybe it's just not available. And if it's the latter, then I am disappointed, because there's the technology there, and I just wish that I could see like a normal rev counter and a normal speedo, but as it turns out I can't. It's all very configurable on the outside, but seems not so much on the center dial, etc. The matrix LED headlights on this car are unbelievably good. Headlight technology in general is so good amongst or across pretty much all the brands that I get to drive. The laser lights in my M3 Touring, they're amazing. These are incredible as well. They are so intelligent. Big regret is I didn't get out and actually film a video of this at night with those matrix LEDs working, because they work so well. Honestly, the passenger display, I mean, that over there, if you've got to pay extra for that, I'm not sure if it comes standard on some models, or just a complete waste of money, waste of time. And I don't think it actually looks that good. I think it's almost like an afterthought just stuck on there. Forget it. It won't work without a passenger sitting there, which makes sense because, well, yeah, I shouldn't be trying to activate it. But even when it does, what is the point in it? You've got everything on this lovely big display. So absolute waste of time. That was a good bit of driving there from the E-Class. Anyway, I'm going to crack on. We're 5 minutes away from a little bit of motorway. I'll join you once we've done that motorway section and we've turned off down towards Bicester, and we can continue with this old school Joe Achilles car review. We're just coming up to the Bicester turn-off. We've been on the road for 23 minutes and we've covered just over 20 miles. Our average consumption is 49.7 MPG, so very close to what Audi claim as the combined, which I believe was 53. So let's see if that continues to rise. We hit a little bit of traffic coming up to this motorway section. This car is interesting at slower speeds and in standstill traffic or stop-start traffic like this. And we'll talk more about that once we get into Bicester in 5 minutes' time. But essentially, the electrical energy element of the running gear is what helps you in really slow speed stuff. So now we're crawling up this hill in electrical energy only. I know that because the slightly odd rev counter that I've got down here, well, there's nothing showing. If I put my foot down a little bit more, there you go, now it's fired up. I can hear that diesel unit. It's a 4-pot diesel. It's a 2-litre TDI we're very familiar with, and I'm sure Audi have played with it a little bit for this very latest evolution, but it's still a loud, not that sonorous 4-cylinder 2-litre diesel. In terms of sound insulation, well, this car is really impressive, and I'm sure manufacturers like Audi have learned a lot over the past, let's say, 6 to 8 years with their EV only cars, because they've got to be silent everywhere. So in terms of like squeaks and rattles in this cabin, there are none. It's so well put together. And in terms of wind noise, well, there's nothing. Even at 70 miles an hour, you can't hear anything. This particular car does have double glazing, so that I'm sure helps in terms of keeping those sounds down. I say that as we hit quite a loud piece of tarmac, but I'm sure once we hit this newer tarmac here, it goes silent again. So it's a very pleasant place to spend a lot of time in. I've been on a few trips in this with Lou, and you can have a very easy conversation at motorway speeds without any issues whatsoever. You compare that to something like my M3 Touring, big wide tyres and loud exhaust, etc. Okay, it's a bit of an extreme, but it's a lot easier in something like this car. We didn't talk about the steering wheel earlier on, and although I'm not the biggest fan of the way it looks with this sort of double flat bottomed, I'm also not the biggest fan of all these haptic buttons. Not so much by the way they work, because you're not going to be tracking this car, you're not even really going to be doing too much spirited driving in it, so the chance of you fouling it is probably less, although I have called a few people by accident because that call button is so far out towards the rim of the wheel. But the main reason I don't like these haptic buttons and this sort of black mirror finish is they just get so grubby so quickly, and that goes for this panel down here in the door, which controls my lights. Not that we really play around with lights these days because they're all automatic, but fog lights, etc. Your central locking on the car, things like your mirrors, and below that you've got your traditional electric window buttons, which are thankfully very traditional looking buttons. In fact, they look like electric window buttons from Audis of the past, of the way past, which isn't a bad thing, and they feel great. But yeah, that control pad and these buttons up here and all that, it's just grubbiness. I tend to think that my hands are relatively clean all the time, but every time I jump in this car, I give it a wipe, and 20 minutes later, there's just greasy fingerprints over everything, and that's just the reality of it. Our hands and our fingers are naturally greasy, and that grease ends up absolutely everywhere. And that's just another joy of modern cars, unfortunately. Right, we're approaching Bicester and Bicester Village, which hopefully isn't surrounded by too much traffic at this time on a weekday. Coming in here, number one, would make the tests more realistic, and number two, would give you more of an idea of how this mild hybrid plus system works, because unlike many other 48 volt mild hybrid systems that you maybe know when it's doing a little bit to help you, but most of the time it's kind of not really relevant and doesn't seem to make much of a difference. Whereas in this particular car and setup, you really do know that it's working a lot of the time. For instance, let's see how long we can use the mild hybrid system for. So at the moment, the combustion engine is shut off. So we're sitting here, everything running, a bit like a start-stop system in your car. But when I come off that brake, it's going to start rolling forward, and it's doing that through electrical energy only. So off the brake, in fact, I have to give it a little bit of throttle because I think I'd put the hold on there. So we're 10 miles an hour now, and it still hasn't fired into action. I don't know what speed it does fire up. We're 20 miles an hour now, and we still don't have a combustion engine working. Oh, there you go. Kicked in at about 25 miles an hour. So around a lot of town and city driving, and when I leave my close where I live early in the morning, or even when I took this out earlier on, I can do all of that using the small battery in the boot and the power generator, I think they call it, which is really impressive. And it kind of makes sense because combustion engines, especially diesels, are very efficient at constant speeds, faster speeds, motorway speeds, 50, 60, 70 miles an hour. Very efficient, very good use case. Electrical motors or electric cars, EVs, are very efficient for the slower speed stuff, so getting around towns, villages. Also, they make more sense for those sort of speeds because whilst I'm doing this, I'm not emitting any exhaust emissions. So that little baby over there isn't breathing any exhaust emissions from my car, even though this diesel is extremely clean. It's not, and I think that is a good thing. Where the electricity has come from, i.e. the diesel combustion engine, yeah, well, you could argue that's good and a bad thing. The bottom line is, whilst I'm rolling through Bicester here, I haven't used the combustion engine. It might kick into action. In fact, I've not driven it this far on electrical energy only so far in the time that I've had this car, and I don't know how long that will last because we've only got a 1.7 kilowatt hour battery in the boot. So I'm sure it will fire up eventually. But what I wanted to show you was just like the slow speed stuff and what it's like when we park, because obviously parking is slow enough to utilize the battery. So let's oh, that's no parking at any time. Let's go into the car park here. Am I allowed to go in here? Yes, I am. I think they're going to nab that space, and I'll let them nab that space because I'm not actually looking for a parking space. In fact, I don't really need to demonstrate because so far, well, it's not kicked in at all. So this is actually a really good example. And also what I've just picked up on and realised is my average MPG instead of going down in a scenario like this, if I just had a combustion engine car, because they're not efficient at slower speeds, as we talked about, all this start-stop, actually what's happened is my average MPG has started creeping up because I'm only using electrical energy, and therefore I'm not using the diesel engine. So now I'm actually at 53.2 MPG, which is pretty much exactly what Audi claim this car will do on the combined cycle. So that's all really interesting. I mean, we've been, what, 3-4 minutes now? No combustion engine. Another baby in a pushchair, happy. Especially as I let them cross the road, no worries. Anyway, well, that's interesting. So's that. A2, very cool. Way ahead of its time. The Audi A2 was like the BMW i3 is to BMW. Well ahead of its time, fantastic bit of kit. Really, really good. This car likes 20 zones, it really does. That combustion engine is still sleeping, which is really nice. And that MPG is still creeping up. Brilliant, really, really interesting. Right, I'm gonna slowly make my way back out of Bicester and head back towards the M40 motorway before heading east towards Banbury, and yeah, I'll join you once we get on that motorway and we can have another little update. Petrol station. I haven't been near one of those in the 9 days that I've had this car, and I've still got half a tank of fuel. Diesels are so good. Have I ever mentioned that I love diesels? Well, I love diesels, and I tell you what, I take my hat off, in fact I have taken my hat off, to Audi for giving us this option. Thank you. You join me just approaching Banbury. We've covered just over 41 miles and we're still averaging just over 50 miles to the gallon. I feel that this car does pretty much exactly 50 miles to the gallon at 70 miles an hour. Just for reference, this has a 7-speed S-tronic gearbox, and in 7th at 70 miles an hour, it's doing about 1800 RPM. So it's being very efficient, but not as efficient as something like my good friend's Patrick's Volkswagen Passat with the 1.6 TDI, the same engine that we did that hypermiling challenge in. His car on a similar journey would be sitting at low 60s, whereas we're at very low 50s. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that this has a lot more power, probably almost twice the power of Patrick's. It's also a lot heavier. This is 1,850 odd kilos, which is about 250 kilos more than the A4 Avant 2-litre TDI that it replaces. And I would assume the majority of that is that mild hybrid plus system, the battery, the power generator, which kind of sits down here somewhere just behind the combustion engine. That weight at higher speeds isn't so relevant, but at lower speeds it is. It's also a bigger car, as we talked about, longer. It's very impressive, but no more impressive than diesels of old. We're now off the motorway and back on A roads, heading towards Brackley, which is going to be our finish point. This particular bit of dual carriageway is quite a slog actually. It's an uphill section for about 2 miles, so I'm sure that's going to eat into our average and probably bring it down below 50, but we should gain some of that back on the last little section heading towards Brackley. Something to talk about as we're approaching a roundabout is obviously this car relies on a lot of regen, because that battery charges up from the regeneration. So as we're slowing down here, I can feel, even before I get on the brakes, it's regenning, so I can feel the car slowing down a bit quicker than it would naturally. You can adjust and configure all of that so that, you know, it's not always doing that. If you don't like the feeling of your car slowing down on itself by its own, you can switch all of that stuff off. But actually, I find in this particular setup, it's configured really well. So if you know the roads, you know even a set of traffic lights or a roundabout or something that you're coming up to, you come off the accelerator and this car will actually slow you down nicely for that roundabout or for that junction, for that speed limit change, etc. So that's really useful. Again, you've just got to adapt slightly to how you drive it to extract the best efficiency out of it. Now we're back on a 50 here, and I think 50 is a very efficient speed. In fact, that Passat long distance video that we did, I think we sat at about 55, 56 most of the journey. If we'd sat at 50, we would have probably eked out even more, but yeah, that would have meant another hour or two on the roads and upsetting a lot of trucks and buses, etc. in the process. So just sitting here at 50, we're doing 1500 RPM. In fact, the combustion engine has just turned off. So that electrical energy on this flat section of road is now powering the car. We're now going to slight incline and the combustion engines come back in. At these speeds, that's a very smooth transition between electrical energy only and then the combustion engine kicking in. I have got a couple of smaller complaints that at lower speeds, especially when the combustion engine is cold. So the first 5 minutes of driving this car, sometimes you'll come out of a 30 zone or a town or a village or whatever, and the way the combustion engine kicks in is just a little bit agricultural. It's a bit jerky and loud and whatever. Higher speeds, you don't even notice it. And once it's warm, you don't notice it so much at slower speeds. But when it's cold, as with so many hybrids, you've got that problem of the combustion engine being stone cold. Might be the first time it's fired up. You know, if you're leaving your little close or where you live and you're driving through a village and town and, you know, 3 or 4 minutes into your journey, you then hit an A or B road, that's the first time potentially that your combustion engine fires into life. So it's going to be stone cold at that point. So it's going to be really loud and noisy, and that is going to be very difficult for manufacturers to smooth out, especially when you're talking about a 4-cylinder diesel. Coming up to a couple of bends here. So do we talk about driving dynamics in this car? Well, if you've watched my S5 video, you'll probably see that I'm not that impressed by that car. I know a few people have said that it's actually dynamically not bad, but I disagree. In the short time I had behind the wheel of one down in Nice, south of France, to me it just felt like a relatively fast car in a straight line that was pretty numb to steer. It really was. It's over 2 tons, the S5 Avant, off memory, and it just didn't feel that great to pilot down a twisty road. You felt its size and its mass, and it just started to understeer when I really pushed that car. And although I've not really pushed this car hard in the time that I've had it, it kind of feels the same. There's probably a little bit more steering feel, and it feels a little bit more agile because it is 200 kilos lighter than the S5, but it's still no driver's car, that's for sure. And I think a lot of the reason why it's no driver's car is because of its really long wheelbase. So everything feels a bit lazy. It's accurate, it handles relatively well, but it's just a bit lazy. Just feels a bit slow to react because that front axle, where the steering is a long way away from the rear axle. So everything just feels a little bit delayed and slow. So in terms of driving dynamics, it hasn't set my life on fire, but then I wasn't expecting it to, and I don't think anyone buying an A5 or an A5 Avant 2-litre TDI is looking for that sort of car. And actually, while we're on that subject, the more time I've spent with this car, the more I've understood and enjoyed it, appreciated it for what it is. I approached it maybe in the wrong way. You see, I've just had an RS6 GT from Audi, and before that I had an RS6 Performance. So I've gone RS6 Performance, RS6 GT, A5 Avant 2-litre TDI. And I guess getting back in something with an Audi badge on it is always going to be a bit underwhelming when you've jumped out of a £200,000 limited edition RS6. Once I got my head around what this car was and reset my expectations, it's actually been really lovely to live with. Anyway, we're fast approaching Brackley, where I'm going to end this video. We'll look at the figures right at the end. Let's give you a conclusion, a summary of this car. At £60,000 for this particular launch edition, it's a bit of a liberty. It's too expensive. Unless you were getting a really good discount or really good finance deal, or as a company car or something, I would urge you away from spending 60 grand on one of these, especially when you go onto Auto Trader and you look at a 6-month-old A4 Avant with a 2-litre TDI. That's going to set you back just over 30 grand. So half the price for a better looking car that in reality would be just as efficient as this car on the long run. It hasn't got the fancy hybrid system, but it has a bigger boot, and yeah, there's arguments to say that it's a better car, and there's arguments to say that it's not as good as this very latest iteration. But you can get one of these, as we talked about in the intro, for 45, 46 grand for the entry level 2-litre TDI that still has the fancy mild hybrid plus system. So at 45 grand in today's overinflated market, it kind of starts to make more sense. And if you just want a car, practical car, that gets you and your family around in efficiency with a bit of hybrid technology that is very well put together, and I'm not sure about the styling myself. I don't think it's ugly, I don't think it's pretty, but a lot of people I've bumped into have asked me what it is and have said it's pretty, so maybe it's my bad taste, I don't know. Regardless, it is a really good and compelling package, and something that has grown on me. And it's one of those cars that, well, when it goes back in a couple of hours time to the wonderful Audi UK press team, I am going to miss this car. And it's weird to think that, because on paper at least it isn't that exciting. In reality it's not that exciting, but it's just a nice car to do things in. It's been a great bit of kit. Peggy loves the boot. Lou and I have had some great journeys and outings in this car in the time that I've had it. And the best thing about it is the fact that although I've used it a lot, I've done about 400 miles in this car in the past 7 or 8 days. Well, it's barely used any fuel. It's used coming up to half a tank of fuel, and that's mixed driving, including this 52 miles that we've just covered. So I think that's the best thing about it, is every time I get in it, the fuel gauge barely moves, and that is a diesel. That's what diesels are so good at, fuel gauges not moving. And to think that in 2025, couldn't think what year we're in there, it's great that you can still buy a diesel German wagon. It really is. I wish that BMW offered a 3 Series diesel, even a 4-pot diesel like a 320d in the UK, but they don't, and I think that's a really, really bad and short-sighted move. In terms of the figures, now we're parked up and stopped, 51.4 MPG on the combined. As you've seen, we've done town, car park, traffic, A, B roads and motorways, and we're at 51.4, which is 1.5, 1.6 MPG off what Audi claim on the combine. This particular press car, I think, has done about 2,500 miles since new. So it's still relatively tight, and I'm sure 6 months down the track or a year down the track, once it's done 10, 15,000 miles, it will be more efficient again, because that's how all cars, or at least combustion engine cars, operate. They're never as efficient as they should be when they're brand new, like this car. They get better with a few miles on them. Guys, thanks for tuning in. I will see you at another video very, very soon.